We're so glad you're here. This summer, you've been hearing a phrase an awful lot. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. That's from the first verse of the 5th chapter of what we call the book of Galatians, which was a letter from the Apostle Paul to the churches in Galatia. And this letter, we've been setting it up every week so we can kind of get the context of what's going on. This was a time of change in the life of the very early Christians. This is the first century. And the initial believers in Jesus, the initial followers of the way, were all Jewish people. Jesus was a Jew. All of his disciples were Jews, and they had been raised in the Torah. They had been raised in the Jewish traditions and laws and ceremonies. And they came to find Jesus Christ, and they weren't starting a new religion. They just called this following of Jesus the way of Jesus, or the way. And then they were so excited to share this good news of Jesus that more people heard the story of his life and death and resurrection, including some people who weren't Jews, what the New Testament calls the Gentiles, and they came to faith. And so these early Christians were trying to figure out just what is Christianity. Some felt like, well, maybe to follow Jesus, if you're not a Jew, you have to become a Jew to follow Jesus. And others said, no, I can't believe that God would require that. And it was a source of a lot of discussion, a lot of difficult times in those early decades of the church. But they came to the conclusion that no, you didn't have to come to a certain religion to be a follower of Christ. You simply needed to take by faith his grace. Now, not everyone agreed. And that's where we get to the book of Galatians. That's why Paul wrote this letter, because some people were going to these Galatian believers who were largely not Jews and saying, no. You're not really Christians unless you do the things that we've been taught for generations, unless you keep the laws and the rituals and the regulations. And Paul was kind of like, no. The church decided this. Under the guidance of God's Spirit, we decided this. And so he wrote this letter. And it's, as you've seen over the summer, he's a pretty emphatic person in this letter, and he's fairly angry. So he's trying to emphasize. So when he says this phrase we've been listening to, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free, he follows it with this phrase. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free, therefore, do not let yourself get enslaved again. Don't fall into that old thing of you've got to earn your Christianity by the things you do. You've got to earn God's grace somehow. He knew this would be death in two ways. It would be death for the church. It would destroy the church. Can you imagine if we came here every Sunday and part of your job was kind of look the crowd over and say, I wonder if they're a good enough Christian, or I wonder if they do all the right things, or, well, she's a better Christian than he is. I'm sure of that. I mean, you can just imagine. It sounds like a caricature, and yet he's trying to say, no, there's no gradation there. There's no who earns more, who's done more, or anything like that. It would destroy the church. The other thing we've talked about more the last couple of weeks is that it also is toxic to our souls. If I have to worry about if I've done enough, if I'm good enough, I'm always measuring. I'm always taking my spiritual pulse. Am I good enough? Am I good enough? Is God pleased with me so that I can accept his grace, so I can know his grace? And it's this constant struggle, and Paul calls that slavery. He says, don't fall into that slavery. Grace is so hard for us to accept. Grace is so hard for us to accept. And that's why Paul wrote this letter and says, it is by grace. It is by grace. So we're in this 5th chapter where he starts the chapter saying it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. And down in the 13th verse, he says this, you, my sisters and brothers, were called to be free. But, I hate the but, don't you? I mean, you always hate the but, It's like, that after the but is what the guy really wants to say, not before the but, Phil, you did a good job. But, okay, here we go. Buckle up. So that's the way we use the word, and we're kind of afraid maybe that's the way Paul's using it. Maybe he's saying, okay, we're all free, but not so much. We got to look at this because that is not what Paul is saying. Let's read that verse. It is, my brothers and sisters, you are called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in, and as we read it today from the version we've been using, do not indulge in your selfish desires. Some other versions say, do not indulge in your sinful nature. But it's a specific word that Paul used that is really hard for us to kind of grasp. the literal word he used, he said, we were called to freedom, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Now, that word flesh has been greatly misunderstood over the years because it means different things throughout the ages. And many times in Christian history, we've kind of seen the flesh as kind of, real literal, the flesh is bad. And there are even Christian sects down through the centuries who thought that our bodies were inherently sinful. I'm going to talk about the wind in a second. So that's a pre-illustration there, okay? I'm going to just take some equipment. No, I won't do that. There we go. They actually thought that the earth was sinful and everything about it, and the spirit was what was good. So people would talk about our bodies as this terrible thing we have to shed, or they diminished most sins to like physical sins, sexual sins, addiction sins, things like that. And that's not what Paul is saying. He's not setting up the flesh here with the spirit somewhere. He's talking about these two concepts of this new thing that Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. He's saying that the flesh, or the way of the world, is the old, tired way of thinking. The kingdoms of this world, that it's about competition, it's about power, it's about domination, it's all these things. He's going, no, that's the flesh. The spirit is something altogether different. Living in the spirit is a different reality than giving your life to this present reality in the principalities and powers, the governments, the world, the values of this kingdom on earth. Now, the Bible teaches, the New Testament teaches about the Spirit in various cases, but my favorite is Jesus' description of the Spirit. One night, a man named Nicodemus came to Jesus. Nicodemus was one of the Jewish leaders. He was highly respected. He was conversant in all of the Jewish laws and traditions. But he'd been listening to Jesus talk, and he was so captivated by it. He came to Jesus one night and he said, "You're different. I mean, there's something about your teaching that rings with authority that I'm not getting, I'm not understanding, and I want to know." And it's funny what Jesus said to him. The first thing he said was, you need to experience the birth of the Spirit. Sometimes that's translated birth from above. Sometimes it's translated a second birth. He's saying we're talking about a different reality here. And Nicodemus is trying to figure it out. And Jesus says, unless you have this kind of birth in your life, you can't even see the kingdom of heaven. It's an amazing picture because Jesus is standing in front of Nicodemus. Jesus is eternity entering time. Jesus is the kingdom who's come to earth. And he's saying to Nicodemus, you can't even see me, really, can you? You can't see the kingdom under the old way of thinking. You can't see the kingdom under the old way of prioritizing. You can't do that. And then Jesus explains this spiritual reality. He says, the wind blows wherever it wants to. Now, in the New Testament, there's this word that we use all the time. It's in the Greek language, it's pneuma in the original language. And the word pneuma means wind. Some of you use pneumatic switches, the wind-powered switches. The pneuma is also the breath. We talk about that even in medical terms. Pneumonia is a disease of breathing. But pneuma also means spirit in the New Testament. So it's amazing. There's this word that means wind, breath, spirit, and Jesus is actually doing a play on words here with Nicodemus. He's saying, Nicodemus, the pneuma blows wherever it will. The wind blows wherever it will. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't know where it's going. You don't know what it's doing. You can't even see it. Really, none of us have ever seen the wind, ever. We've seen the effects of the wind. We've seen dust flying, we've seen trees bending, and many times we'll go, oh, look at the wind out there, but we can't actually see the wind. Jesus said, you can't see the wind, where it's going, what it's doing, where it's come from. He says, so it is with everyone born of the pneuma. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. He's trying to describe the Spirit of God as this, not a thing, not an entity, but as the very breath of God. The very breath in our lungs, the very wind on our planet, the very being of God that is everywhere, always. And he says this spirit is where I want you to live, Nicodemus. You're living under these laws and these rules, and your motives are good, and you're trying to do the right thing, but there's something you're missing. And that thing that you're searching for and missing is living within the Spirit, walking with the Spirit. And Jesus takes this concept to help you and I get God out of the box. So many people are trying to define God. So many people are trying to tell people what God says. Go online if you want to know what God says, because there's a lot of people who want to tell you exactly what God said today, you know? They're always saying that God does this, God has to do this, God never does this. And Jesus says, you don't even know where the wind's blowing, do you? You don't know where it came from. You don't know. He says, I want you to know this wind. I want you to know this Spirit. I want you to live in this Spirit. Always reminds me of those lyrics from the late Rich Mullins. He says, there's a wideness in God's mercy I've not found in my own. And he keeps a fire burning to melt this heart of stone. Keeps me aching with a yearning. Keeps me glad to have been caught in the reckless, raging fury that they call the love of God. If we could just see the love of God as this wind that is blowing through our lives. And that's what Paul is saying in the book of Galatians. Here's the part where I wanted the wind to come right in the middle of that last illustration, but it didn't. Here's what he says about this wind. Here's what he says about this Spirit. He's talking about, and people think this is two lists maybe, like there's a list that you heard read that was all bad stuff, you know, sexual immorality and vain ambitions and all that kind of stuff. And then this other spirit they call the fruit of the Spirit. And people think the but is there's two lists. You know, there's this one list that's all against the law, this other list that we've got to accomplish. The bad stuff and the good stuff, that's not at all what Paul is saying. He's saying that the works, the results of the values of this world are all those things. All that junk, strife and envy, violence, hatred, competition, overbearing oppression. He says that's all the result of living with the values, the old, tired values of this world. He says, but the fruit, that word means result, the fruit of this wind that is blowing through us, here's the fruit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You know, I spent a good part of my life reading those things, and when you read the fruit of the Spirit, it just makes you hungry, doesn't it? Man, that's what I want. I want to live in love. I want to live in joy. I want to live in peace. I want to live in this reality. And so what I did as a young Christian, I'd say, okay, I've got to read all these every day, and I've got to practice these things. And I still quote them all to myself every day. But I was thinking that these fruits of the Spirit, these results of the Spirit, were things that I had to focus on. And when I got all those in a row, then I knew that I was really following God. That's the exact opposite of what he's saying. He's saying, follow me. Let the wind blow through you. Live in that relationship with me. And the fruit or the result is, in ever-increasing measure, love. You'll love more now than you did 2 years ago. You'll love more next year than you do now. Joy. Yeah, joy that's not defined by circumstances, but joy that somehow in the midst of circumstances, it's not just an emotion of happiness, but somehow there's this deep-seated reality of God in our lives that brings a sense of joy and peace. The Spirit is feeding into us a kindness and a gentleness that is not ours. It's not something we manufacture. And when we look at these beautiful, beautiful qualities, love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, generosity, self-control, goodness, when we look at these as things to be accomplished, we miss the whole script of the book of Galatians. He's saying to us, if we are to live by the Spirit, let's keep in step with the Spirit. What does it mean to keep in step with the Spirit? What does it mean for me to live in this raging fury of God's love? What does it mean for me to live in the breath of God day by day. Well, it can't mean earning it because I couldn't do anything to earn it. It can't mean that these are deeds for me to do because then it's just overwhelming. If I say my job today is to do all these things, I'll fail, by the time I get out of bed. It's got to be something else. It is, I believe, an awareness of God's presence in our lives. It is our task, our growth, our journey to be aware. See, Jesus said very often when he'd tell a parable, he'd say, you have eyes, now use them. He who has eyes, let him see. You have ears, you have spiritual receptors. I've created you in my image. My image means that you have spiritual receptors. You can see the Spirit in different ways. You can know the Spirit in different ways. No, you can't see the wind, but you see it when you see it, And he says, I want you to learn to see. I want you to learn to listen. I want you to learn to walk in that way. And that is the journey that we are on, not hoping that somehow God may be merciful to me, but basking in the mercy that's already been given, basking in the Spirit that's already been poured in our lives. He breathed, this is the book of Genesis, only in Hebrew, ruach, same thing, breath. He breathed into man the Spirit of life. He breathed into woman the Spirit of life. He breathed into us the Spirit of life and says, I want you to see it. So Jesus told all these wild parables to make people go, huh? I never thought of it that way. Of course you didn't. But that's how I want you to see life. I want you to see the Spirit in that way. So, how do we do that? I mean, how do I raise my awareness? Well, you'll do it differently than you and you and you and me. We'll all do it differently. But one of the things we've done for a couple thousand years is these things we call spiritual practices. These are not rules. These are not laws. These are practices. They used to call them spiritual disciplines a lot. I never liked that word because, to me, every discipline in my life was something I made myself do because I really didn't want to do it, And I want to see Jesus. I want to see the Spirit. So spiritual practices are things we do to help open our eyes and help open our ears. Did you know that? I think so many times we've had the spiritual practices, we pray. And people think, well, I pray because I ought to pray. I pray because I feel less guilty when I pray. But if you feel less guilty when you pray, I can take that away from you right away. I can walk up to you and say, do you pray enough? Nobody says, hey, Pastor, I pray way more than I should. Nobody says that. Everybody, well, probably not enough. Do you give enough? Do you do enough? That's this backward way of doing it. No, our practices, we don't pray so that we appease God. We don't pray to make us worthy. We pray to see where God is, what God is doing, to hear him, to know him on a spiritual level that we can't simply by discussing it, but interacting with God. And we all grow in different ways. Some of you feel the presence of God so powerfully when you're serving. That makes sense. That makes total sense because Jesus said, when you serve the most under-resourced, when you serve the most oppressed people in this world, he says, you're seeing me right there because that's where I am. When you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. Some of you in times of worship, you leave a place and you don't leave worship saying, wow, that was a great drum riff on the third song. No, you go saying, I just saw God or sensed God in a way that I don't usually day by day. We're going to talk about practices in the fall, and they're very, very important because they are not the new rules. They are not the commandments. They are us saying, I want to know him. I want to know him. I want to see him. And I just tell you, as you go in that journey, you'll more and more attune yourself and teach yourself to see and hear him. But we do that in community. We do that privately, but we also do it in community because part of our faith cannot be even put in perspective without community. I can't understand God alone on an island somewhere. I can only understand God in your embrace and your encouragement. You can only understand God amongst each other. We only understand God that way. And it's in these places where we see God. If you would look around on the hill today, I won't make you do it now. I hate pastors who say, everybody do this. But if you were to look around the hill today, Jesus is all over the place on this hill. Yes, in the grass, in the green, in the wind, but in these people around you, those children back there. How can you not see Jesus in them? I know some days it's easier than others. I get that. But see, he wants us to open this whole thing up. What's he want us to open up? Our spiritual receptors, our eyes and our ears. So he says, Jesus says the wind's blowing all over the place. It's blowing through you. Paul in other letters says that God is over all and through all and is all. Jesus, as we read today from the book of John, said, the Father is in me, I am in you, you're in me. He says, it's here. We don't have to go searching for God. We don't have to do enough stuff so that God says, oh, yeah, I'll show up because you're a pretty good dude. No, we have to just open our eyes, open our ears, open our spiritual receptors. It's the journey we take together. One of the things we do in our summer time is taking the sacrament together. That's another way. Nobody's earning God's favor in the sacrament. It's a way for us to learn and to open up. And one of the things is our public confession. That's one of the things we do together. And it is also a way that we allow the Holy Spirit to show us something. And I hope that one of the things you'll see in our confession is it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Our confession is not about our sin. Our confession is about his grace. I hope we can see that today. Lynn is going to come and lead us in our confession. It's in your book, and you can follow along.